What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode from the League FFB. Today, we're going to be talking Dynasty Fantasy Football, and not just Dynasty Fantasy Football. We're going to be talking Dynasty Strategy. So, if you're a part of the Discord, I gave you guys a sneak peek to what was coming. Today, we have a special guest. We're with Jay Stein. He's with the Football Guys and the Devi Royale. And so, today, we're going to be talking about his series that he wrote. It's called the Dynasty Investor. So, I don't want to waste anybody's time. Let's get Jay up on the screen right away, and let's start talking the Dynasty Investor. Jay, how are you?
I'm doing great. It's a holiday weekend, so feeling good here in Columbus, Ohio. And I'm excited to talk to you about some dynasty strategy. So,
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you taking the time to come on the show. And yes, it is a holiday weekend, so it's not a bad weekend at all.
yeah, exactly.
All right, man. So for the Dynasty Investor, I have to admit, I've been following the series for a while. I even followed it when you were back with Dynasty Nerds. Now you're with Football Guys. And if you were going to talk about the Dynasty Investor and kind of give it or introduce it to somebody that has never heard of it before,
Yeah.
how would you describe it to them?
Yeah, that's a great intro. So, the Dynasty Investor is really about uh, value as a strategy. And the way that I think about value is it's, you have what you have to pay for something, but then you have what something is fundamentally worth. So there's two separate things. If you go and buy something, like buy a football card off of somebody, you have to pay a certain price for it. But that price isn't necessarily what you transacted for. That price isn't necessarily what it's worth. What it's worth is a different sort of calculation. It has to do with the future returns. It could be completely different than the price that you actually paid. So my process for as a strategy for fantasy football is trying to figure out those differences. Where is the price different from what that player is actually fundamentally worth? And I go through and I come up with what the fundamental value is for each of these players based on a process, which I'm sure we'll get into. But that's the main gist of it. Is I'm going to try and find these inefficiencies in the market where price doesn't match up with value and capture that value for your fantasy team.
Yeah, and I think one of my favorite things that I've seen from the article is how you mentioned that as fantasy football players, and more specifically dynasty fantasy football players, we talk about value all the time and we use the word value, but this strategy is a way to actually give meaning to what the value is, and it actually allows you to see what the value actually is without just having it be a hunch that we have as fantasy players.
Yeah, exactly. It's actually like putting concrete numbers to things, and that's actually one of the main reasons I actually got started in this. I was a major consumer of all of this. I was a degenerate in a bunch of leagues, and one of the things that irked me a little bit was like these analysts that put out these are my top five values or whatever in the draft, but you didn't, or my top five buys in the draft. There's no sort of like accountability for what that actually meant. Do you mean like ADP? Do you mean it could mean a bunch of things. And so what I want to do is I was sort of like refine and define what value means to me and what that process means. So when I go and do this and I come up with a fundamental worth of a player, then I'm actually putting price targets on these players and then deciding whether I want to buy or sell them. And I can tell you if a player is worth 5,000 and I think he's worth 6,000, I'd say I think you should buy this player. He's worth 6,000. He's currently trading at 5,000. That represents, I don't know, 15% upside. And and then you can put that idea to work. And it's also measuring the value that you're creating, right? So if I give that recommendation, eventually I'm going to take that recommendation down. So I'm going to say you should buy this player, and then he gets to that price target. I'll say, okay, now you don't need to be buying him anymore. You can hold him at that point, and for that matter, that trade worked. And the same thing on the other side. So I'm gonna keep myself accountable for my misses and my hits. and really actually determine what sort of numbers, what exact value you're bringing to the game.
Yep, exactly. And it's almost as if you're taking the emotional value that you have in these players out of it, and you really are strictly looking at them as numbers and production in this game, and you're trying to get the most out of them in that aspect, right?
Yeah, it's definitely player agnostic, and what the way that the process works is, am I trying to compare similar players to come up with a valuation? So it's not necessarily just cut and dry. So there is like this process of clustering players into similar groups, and the clusters have to do with age, production, and potential. So when you're looking for value, it's really tough to go and look at Justin Jefferson versus Mike Evans, because they're in two different parts of their careers, right? Exactly. And so when I go through and I do this clustering process, I'm going to look at Justin Jefferson versus Jamar Chase and look and see if there's any discrepancy there between the points and the price that you have to pay for those. And when you put those together, you can kind of come up with maybe there's some inefficiencies there. But yeah, I mean, in a sense, it's very player agnostic, because you're not playing favorites. You're trying to put people into groups, and in that sense, you are like defining the potential of a guy. And so there's a little bit of bias in that when you're trying to cluster people up. But even then, there's some mechanical aspects to it, because age and production are the first part of that, and we have an idea of we clearly know what their age is, but we have an idea of what their production is based on what they've done in the past or what they could do. And then the last part of that is potential, and that is the kind of maybe the bias a little bit. But I'm trying to take most of the bias out and just sort of act on, okay, this guy is looking very cheap versus the people that are in his cluster that looks like a buy, even though maybe like he's not my favorite player, or or maybe he is my favorite player and he winds up in a sell because too many people have been buying him. And that's the gist of the market, and how value is created, is that like there's euphoria and depression, right? So once somebody gets hot and the market starts getting hot on it, everybody wants that player. A lot of people start trading him, price gets pushed up. And then eventually his price gets pushed up too far. It overreacts. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter how much you really like that player. This is where that player agnostic piece comes in. It doesn't matter how much you really like that player. At some point, you'd receive too much value back if you trade him, if you moved him, than if he was to be on your fantasy team. And so that's sort of what that player agnostic piece of it comes from, and the reverse for the sell side as well. But I mean, at some point, you'd be willing to move off the player even if you really like him, and so that's I completely agree that you're sort of taking your own biases out of it and just strictly looking at what's the upside downside of these players.
Absolutely. And I think as dynasty managers, at times we do all get that emotional ties to these players, right? Because these guys are players that we're putting on our rosters, we're winning championships with. Like, I'm guilty of it. I will forever be a Josh Allen truther because he won me my first dynasty championship. So I want to throw that out there, but this does allow people to kind of take the name, take the feeling out of it, and show us the value. So with that being said, there's a formula that goes into this, because you talk about the numbers. We're putting physical numbers to it. Yeah. So walk me through the formula. How do we get to these numbers, and how do we implement this and use this if we wanted to look at a player ourselves?
Yeah, so the way that it works is I've basically taken the PE ratio from the investment worlds of how to like value a stock. It's a very classic valuation style, but pretty simple in a sense. So I think it's easily applicable to fantasy football. And the PE ratio is the price to earnings ratio. And so for fantasy football, what we're going to look for is a price. So how can we measure price? And the way that I do that is through Keep Trade Cut. Keep Trade Cut is a website that uses crowdsourcing to figure out values for players. And everybody that visits the site, you get a question whether you keep, trade, or cut certain players, and then they have an algorithm comes up with those values. They actually call it values. I would actually think that it's more along the lines of price, but and I use that as my price. What does it cost to own, or what is the price to own one share of a player? And that's my price. So that's the numerator in the equation, the P of the PE ratio. The next piece of it is the E, so the earnings per share. If you were in the stock market, it'd be earnings per share. For fantasy football, that's the fantasy points per game. That's a player's earnings. Every time he steps out on the field and puts up fantasy points, those are his earnings, and you get 17 chances to do that during the season. And so the points per game is what the earnings is. So what I do is I take the price, the KTC, divided by the earnings, which is the fantasy points per game. I actually divide it by 10 then, and that gives me a player's PE ratio. The divided by 10 doesn't really mean anything. It just makes the numbers easier to work with. So that, the price divided by earnings equals the PE ratio. And that's the main genesis of how the valuation works. So what you do is, after you do that, if you're comparing similar players, again, we're not doing Justin Jefferson and Mike Evans. We're doing Justin Jefferson versus Jamar Chase. You compare the similar players. The one with the lower PE is the one that has the better value. And what I would say is, it's all relative, right? So, just because one looks really, really cheap on this doesn't mean that you should go out and buy him. Just because you have a low PE does not mean he's a buy. And so if you're trying to implement it yourself, it's about your relative PE versus very similar players, a cluster of very similar players. And that's the gist of it. So that's the formula.
Okay. So we're taking these guys, probably guys that we would call in the same tier, right? So we're looking at tiers, and we say, okay, who is the best value in this tier? And you are targeting those players if you have somebody in that tier, maybe who's a little bit pricier, and you're going to go for the lower price, but maybe gives you the same production or better production. And that's how you're going to create variance in your fantasy rosters, right?
Yeah, that's the gist of it. And like a lot of that time, it has to do with trading and how you get those players on your roster. But that's the gist of it. So the next step after I find the PE ratio is I cluster them into different groups, and then my assumption is that all of these guys that are in this group who have similar age, similar production, similar potential. All of those guys should trade at the same valuation. So I take the average of all of those guys' PE ratios and then reverse out of the equation to a KTC price target for each of those guys. So it's basically like a reversion to the mean strategy. So if you have a cluster of, let's say, wide receivers, say it's Tyreek Hill, Stephon Diggs, Cooper Kupp, and Devontae Adams, those guys are all 29 years old or greater and score about 20 fantasy points per game, have similar potential, as if they're all kind of like approaching that age cliff. My assumption is for those guys, depending on how many points per game I'm projecting they score, they should all trade at the same valuation, the PE valuation. Now, I'm not saying they should trade at the same price, because we're going to have a different projection of fantasy points per game for each of those guys. But they should trade at a very similar PE ratio. So what I would do is I'd go and I'd calculate the PE ratio for all those, take the average PE of all four of those guys, reverse out of the equation to find a price target for each of those guys. And that's dependent on like my expectation for fantasy points per game, what their, and what their group average PE ratio is. So I could say, okay, Tyreek Hill currently is trading at 5,350 KTC, and I think he should be trading at 4,900 KTC. So there's 9% or 7% downside to Tyreek Hill now. Now, how you put that to work, that a lot of the times that has to do with trading, or I guess in startup drafts there's a piece of it as well, but there's kind of some strategies that go along with that. But that's kind of the gist of it.
Cool. All right. So you did mention a little earlier, just because somebody has a lower PE, it doesn't mean that they're a buy. So when you're looking at these guys and that do have low PEs, what kind of things are qualifiers and what kind of things are disqualifiers as far as buys go?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, like I think I fit in that same category as a lot of people, where we're looking at where the situations are, and all that stuff. And like if you go to the very bottom of like a wide receiver list, you'll see some guys with a bunch of lower PEs, and it could signify a lot of different things. It could signify that the player's been injured, and so his price has fallen more than his expected points are. Um, it could be that it as wide receivers or running backs or anybody ages, it could be that he's increased in age to the point where people are worried about an age cliff, and his price keeps falling, but his earnings are still there. The point that you would make is the guys that price is falling, but also earnings is falling as well, but maybe not as much as price. Those are the guys that you probably want to be a little bit concerned about, where the points per game, fantasy points per game, are coming off hard. That's where you can get in a situation where it's tough. But yeah, I mean, I guess the main point that I would make on that is it's relative. So it's who you're comparing it to. So just because like Brandon Cooks looks cheap, is he necessarily a buy? Well, I want to go through my situation and figure out, like, is fantasy points per game safe? Does it look okay? But then I want to see who I'm comparing him to. Am I comparing him to Mike Evans, DeAndre Hopkins, Keenan Allen, Tyler Lockett? Does it make sense that he's actually a buy, even though his PE ratio is so low? That's the kind of process that I'd want to go through to figure out that my low PE may actually be a buy and is not like a bad signal of like this is a low PE, so it should be a buy in any situation. And that's definitely not what I'm saying. It all has to do with who you're comparing him to on the relative basis.
Okay, sounds good. So I want to ask you, because you're the guy with the data, you're the guy who's doing this, crunching the numbers. When you have been doing this lately, is there anybody on your list that's sticking out? Is there anyone who's maybe too pricey? Is there somebody who is a buy?
Pricey? Yeah.
I want to know buys. I want to know sells. Who's on the list right now?
Yeah. So in my published article, the ones I featured were Kyler Murray, Deontay Johnson, and Kyle Pitts as buys.
Okay.
So those are my ones that I think it's gotten too bad. Kyle Pitts is a different case, but for Kyler Murray and Deontay Johnson, those guys, I think we're missing the boat. The market's missing the boat on this. There's a lot of upside. You should be buying these guys in Dynasty fantasy football. I'm not, like redraft is a completely different story, but if you have Dynasty in time, you should buy those guys. So Kyler Murray, he only puts up 20 fantasy points per game seasons. His first year, I think it was 18, but every season he's playing, he's giving you 20 plus fantasy points per game. He is an elite level scorer from a fantasy perspective. My metric is price, your KTC, versus fantasy points per game. The fantasy points per game for him hasn't changed. In Superflex, that's differentiated points per game perspective. His price is cratered. It is fallen. Yeah. It's too cheap for what he offers you. There's a lot of uncertainty about, how much he's going to play next year, that stuff. But when you're thinking about Dynasty, which is much more longer term focused, your windows aren't just 1 year. It's 2 years, 3 years maybe. And you can get him on your squad for not very much. Oh man, I think that's a huge win if you can upgrade to a Kyler Murray. I also think Lamar Jackson right now is a screaming buy. And I want to do when I'm thinking about dynasty strategy and super flex strategy, I want to do everything I can to get those upper tier quarterbacks for super flex. And the guys that can get me into that upper tier and are the cheapest ones are like the Kyler Murrays, Lamar Jacksons, maybe even Deshaun Watson. I don't know how you feel about him, but if he bounces back or not, he's not a top pick. But the Kyler Murray, Lamar Jackson, those guys are cheap ways to right now to trade into that upper tier of quarterbacks, and we know what they are. We know how many points they put up. There's not that uncertainty there. There's uncertainty in the situation, but there's not uncertainty with the players themselves. Deontay Johnson, this was one of my misses last season. I've had a buy on him the whole time. And my thesis on that one is that fantasy points per game is gonna reverse to the mean. And like, how many times does a guy have that good a target share but only or catch 0 touchdowns? So like, we're gonna have some touchdown reversion. He's gonna score more fantasy points at some point. And I like, from all the metrics and stuff like that, when we're looking at target share and all that stuff, he looks really good. So he hasn't like lost the step there. It's just people have abandoned ship. And I think, like, same with Kyle Murray, same with Deontay Johnson, like it's like depression. Nobody wants to own him anymore. And so I think these guys are good, and I think the market's mispricing him. So let's go and buy him. The last one there for the buys was Kyle Pitts. Yep. I'm a strong believer in Kyle Pitts. I think all the metrics are there. He hasn't put up the fantasy points per game yet. Sometimes like we have to buy the quality players, even though the situation isn't the best. And I do think that hopefully next year this improves, but he's only been elite from a metrics perspective at the tight end position. Now we just have to wait for the fantasy points per game, the differentiated fantasy points per game to come. So Kyle Pitts is currently on KTC. He's trading at the number 1 tight end spot. People might say, okay, well, this is first of all, the rankings are dynasty, right? So it's not. We're not talking about redraft. Of course, if we were doing redraft, guys like Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews would be at the top, and they are at the top in Dynasty. But Kyle Pitts is like 200 points above Mark Andrews, and 400, maybe 300 points above Travis Kelce. And it's not like huge numbers there, but he is trading at tight end. But my theory is that Kyle Pitts offers a differentiated tight end position from a points per game perspective eventually. Not right now, but eventually he'll get there, because the metrics say that he's going to be elite, and we just need those fantasy points per game to come through, and they will at some point. And so my valuation, the way that I do his valuation, which is a little bit unique than some of the others, is I don't have anybody clustered up with him, because I think he's somewhere between a wide. I think he can offer wide receiver production at the tight end position. Mm-hmm. So he's got that like unicorn quality where he can actually produce what a wide receiver produce if it works. When it's working, he can put up points like Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase. So I have him as a valuation, my PE. I have like as a discount to the Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson tier. Like I put in like a 25% PE discount to that, and then have estimate his fantasy points per game and get him in there. So like I have him at a price target of 6,400, and he's currently trading at 5,400. So it's about 1,000 KTC dollars, or however you want to think about it. 1,000 KTCs upside is what I'm looking for, which is that's about 18% upside, which it actually can mean a lot when you're thinking about like creating the value. So like, if what the process would be, I want you to buy Kyle Pitts now at 5,400, and then he'll appreciate to 5,600, And then you can either hold on to him at that point, or you can actually realize that KTC value that you've created by selling him if he becomes too expensive, and collecting the extra that you've gained from owning him, or having him on your roster for a bit.
Okay. Yeah. So when you talk about this, my mind goes to like this would be a perfect strategy and something that somebody could implement if they were maybe retooling a roster or rebuilding a roster, because you're able to kind of gobble up some value and still get similar production out of players. Is that kind of something that you would suggest doing? And do you think that you could use this in a contending roster as well?
Oh yes, this is very much for contending rosters and for rebuilding rosters. It's all, I think, when you're contending and when you're rebuilding, it's still about value. You still want to make calls that have to do with valuation. So the point you made, which I thought was interesting, and actually I talk about it in my series quite a bit, is compounding. So what you want to do with compounding is you want to stay in the same cluster. So you're getting a guy that is of similar age, similar production, similar potential, but trades at a cheaper price. So you're trading down the price curve, but the production is the same. The age, you're not losing out any value on the age. The age is the same. So it's just a guy that the market doesn't like as much as the other guy. And you can actually create a lot of value if you do that, as long as you are willing to make those types of bets. And so what you do is you trade the higher price guy for the lower price guy, and you collect that plus more. And then the plus more, this is the compounding part, is just like, it's kind of like compound interest in your bank account, right? So you put money, you earn interest on that money, and then the next month you earn interest on your original principal plus the money that you earned, the interest that you earned last month. So it's like money on money. And that extra that you get for that plus more that you get, that's sort of going to compound, and it just creates more and more value over time. Even if we're talking about like late seconds, or thirds or fourths or stuff like that, as we're collecting those extras, then you can attach those and attach those to trades on the other side of things. And you can hit on some of those rookie picks. It gives you more odds of hitting on more of those rookie picks. And if you hit on a second or third rounder, or these first rounders, then you're creating even more value that you can then use to help you out. So that's that compounding aspect is something that I talk about a lot. I think it's a really cool strategy to implement. Like you have to be able to be active and be trading to try and do that. And the thing is that like not everybody will have all of the players that I'm recommending or not recommending. So or recommending you should sell. So you can't like capitalize on every single thing, but it is actually I think a pretty good strategy to try and implement, even if you are a contending team or a rebuilding team. And like the example here that I gave with Tyreek Hill, Diggs, Cooper Kupp, and Devontae Adams. My point here is that, like, okay, say you have Tyreek Hill on your team, and I think he's 9% overvalued. The other four in that group, there's one, Cooper Kupp, that I think is 12% undervalued. I don't know like what your opinions are on the situations between Tyreek Hill and Cooper Kupp and stuff like that, but Cooper Kupp scores actually more fantasy points than Tyreek Hill does. Like maybe one or two more points per game. And he's done that for consistently. So like you could trade down. Tyreek Hill's trading at 5,400. Cooper Kupp's trading at 4,800. You could trade down from Tyreek Hill to Cooper Kupp, and then whatever that plus more is, then you get to keep that. And as long as you're okay with going from Tyreek to Hill to Cooper Kupp, which I would argue they're very similar in age. Cooper Kupp actually produces more from a production perspective, assuming he's healthy the whole year. Like why not, right? So that's kind of the process, and that would be a contending team move that you could do, where you are collecting extra and maybe even scoring more points than you would before. So just some thoughts.
Yeah, and I'm glad you bring up the draft pick compounds, because I told you I've kind of tried to implement the strategy myself in some leagues, and I've done it a couple times where, like you said, you can go get a late second or maybe an early third or something, and it doesn't seem like a lot today. But we got to remember too, when we compound to those draft picks, whether it be a year down the road or 2 years down the road, those draft picks are continuously gaining value. So come, next month when guys just got drafted to rosters, that second round pick, maybe a week before your rookie draft, that could go for way more than it's actually worth. And you got it thrown in on a trade where you had a guy that you might have even got more points per game from him.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's a great, that's a perfect explanation there. That's exactly what we're trying to do. And even if you're on the contending team, say you pick up that extra second from doing a trade like this, as you get closer to that trade deadline and your team's like right on the fringe or it's very close, you can take that extra second and buy like a veteran, an aging veteran that, scores a ton of points with that second and get a real value from that perspective and help. It could actually help you win. So like it's about the process. Is about like in every trade you want to accumulate a little bit more value each time you do those trades. Each time you make that move, you want to accumulate a little bit more value, and then it all adds up. It adds up to something. So
absolutely. All right. So we've talked about how to implement it. We've talked about the process behind it. Is there anything about the Dynasty Investor that we haven't touched on that you think needs to be talked about?
So, I guess the thing that I would say that I would want to touch on is like, I mentioned this before, sort of like the accountability aspect of this. Guys putting out on Twitter, you should buy these 5 guys, and then the next week you should buy these 5 guys, and then come we don't actually have any follow up. There's no accountability to those recommendations. So what I actually do is I have a track record. So I make the recommendation, you should buy this guy, and then once I realize it, once I say, okay, that guy's price is appreciated to where I think he can get, I'm going to downgrade him from a buy to a hold. That's a realized gain of KTC, and I actually keep track of all of those recommendations, and I publish it in the work. It's on the Dynasty Investor on the Football Guys. And so I think one thing that's really cool about this series is that like you do have like this very defined track record of value that you've added that you can actually prove to. And the one thing I'd say is, if you can put numbers to it, it's a really good way of thinking about it. But so if you take a look at all the trades that I've completed since I started publishing with the Dynasty Nerds and then the Football Guys, all of the ones that I've realized, there's still some open ones that are there, but you'd see that I'd added about 16,500 KTC to people's process. And again, you can't always implement each one of these things. Not everybody can because you don't have all of these players, but 16,500 KTC is it's about 2 Bijan Robinsons worth of value, plus a little bit more than that. So that's kind of like what we're talking about in terms of like just adding up these little chunks, and it's very easy to sort of display how well, or like the actual track record for this. And you can see how good or how bad the model's doing at certain times. So like it's all in the article. There's a very concrete. It has the day I recommended buying or selling the player, the day I recommended downgrading or upgrading the player, and the amount of KTC that was realized for each one of those trades, and that's added up. So I think that's kind of important, just like so people have an understanding of, like, okay, this is all good and well, but like, does it work? And that's the point I would want to make is like, I have 1 year of a track record and we've done fairly well so far in terms of, giving our recommendations.
Perfect. All right, man. So I want to thank you again for hopping on and talking with me and breaking this down. Where can the people find you at? Where can they find the articles? Where can they interact with you?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter. You can find me at _Jason Stein. That's like the main point of contact. My DMs are open, so feel free anytime. Um, then I do the Dynasty Investors. That's at the Football Guys. I'm in their Discord, so you can find me in there. And then I do some like podcasts and some other work for a Patreon called the Devi Royale, which we've been putting a lot of work into the current rookie prospects, current rookie prospects for this year. So the 2023 rookie class, we've been putting a lot of work there in that. So I have like tiers, and then we also do a lot of work on the Devi world. So lots of different rankings and stuff like that. But I do a podcast every Wednesday with Kevin Coleman at Du Bois 22, and we talk about all different types of things, including like mock drafts and prospect profiles and all different kinds of things. So it's really cool. They have an awesome Discord in there where there's a lot of smart people always chatting about this stuff, and that's a good one to get into as well. And you can find me in there as well.
Perfect. Well, thank you again so much, man. I appreciate you taking the time. Like I said, I'm a fan of the series. I think it's fantastic. People can implement it on their teams and just gain that value and keep getting these rosters better and better over the course of time. So thank you again.
No, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, guys. Thank you so much for tapping in and watching this series. Thank you again to Jay Stein, man. If you guys like the content, please leave us a like below. I'm going to link Jay's article down below. So guys, go check it out. Show him some love on that. And the best thing you guys can do to keep our content growing and keep us just growing as a community in general is share the content, like the content, comment on the content. You guys know, do all the good stuff. And if you guys want to talk Dynasty Fantasy Football with us all day long, be on our trade review shows and get advice for your Dynasty rosters, even things like this, go join our Discord. It is linked in the YouTube banner. It'll be linked in the description as well. It's free to join. So go join that. But again, thank you guys for taking some time to watch this with me today. I will see you guys on the next video. Peace out.